Brandon had already been married to Andrea for a year, and at first he admired her dearly. Andrea was a beautiful and homely woman whose house was always clean and tidy. But then everything changed in their lives. Andrea was fired from her job, and she began to spend all day at home. To provide for the family, Brandon had to find a second job. Now, in addition to his office work, he had to work as a longshoreman in the evenings. One day, after a hard day's work in the office and unloading 2 huge trucks, Brandon came home exhausted. But he became very upset to find that the house was untidy and there was no dinner prepared for him. Andrea met him with a manicure file in her hands and babbled softly, "Honey, cook something for yourself, because I'm so tired today. I was at my mother's all day, only recently returned. I helped her to hang a new curtain, and now I decided to treat myself to a manicure. And by the way, I also signed up for a new salon, for a haircut and some hair procedures, so I need money. I haven't been paid yet, but as soon as I get my salary, I'll give it to you right away," said Brandon in a tired voice. On hearing this, Andrea became indignant and accused her husband to leave such a low-paid job. But Brandon did not answer anything and tiredly staggered into the kitchen. The next day, he was unexpectedly invited to visit his mother-in-law, Mrs. Moore. Before, the woman loved to scold her son-in-law on any occasion, but this time she was unusually hospitable and welcoming, and the reason for this change of mood soon became clear to him. "Brandon, I have an anniversary coming up, and the kitchen has become very old. All the doors of the cupboards are falling off. So I thought that the best gift from you and Andrea would be a new repair and a new kitchen set. You were so nice last time when you renovated my bathroom. Now it's turn for the kitchen. What do you think?" Brandon inwardly tensed up. Given that he was the only one earning money in his family, it was easy to guess on whose shoulders would fall the gift from the daughter and son-in-law. A couple of months ago, when Mrs. Moore complained to her son-in-law about a leaky sink and pipes, Brandon decided to please his mother-in-law and spent all the money he had saved for vacations on repairs. He repaired the whole bathroom by himself, since his father had taught him to do everything by his own hands. Back then, he naively believed that his wife's mother would finally start treating him well and stop constantly telling him off. And so it was at first, but soon the woman began to treat him in her usual disgruntled way. Remembering all this, Brandon tried to explain to his mother-in-law that now he and Andrea had not a stable financial situation, especially after Andrea's layoff. But Brandon's statement only provoked a storm of scolding from Mrs. Moore. The woman accused Brandon that he wanted to put the blame for his own failure on the shoulders of her unhappy daughter. In the end, she grabbed her heart with a theatrical gesture and literally pushed her son-in-law out of the apartment. Brandon did not want to upset his mother-in-law, but he had no choice. He was saving up all the money he had earned from his second job to please his wife with the vacation. The man returned from his mother-in-law in a miserable mood, but another scandal awaited him at home. "Are you trying to drive my mother to her grave? Are you out of your mind?" shouted Andrea. "Mom called and told me everything. Shame on you, Brandon." "Andrea, what are you talking about? It's not like that." The man wanted to justify himself. But without letting her husband finish, Andrea loudly slammed the bedroom door, making it clear that the conversation was over and she didn't want to see him there. and in the morning Brandon discovered that she had packed her things and moved in with her mother, leaving only a note with the words, "I'll be back when you learn to earn money." Brandon sighed heavily and closed his eyes. He remembered how he and Andrea had met. She was sitting in a coffee shop and reading. He was very surprised by such a choice of literature and became interested, sat down next to her and asked if she really liked Russian classics. Andrea reassured him with an arrogant look. "If I wouldn't like it, I wouldn't read it. But do you like their literature too?" "Not much, but I like you for sure," Brandon said and smiled. Andrea immediately became embarrassed and blushed. That was how they met each other. Brandon was struck by her modesty and tenderness. She seemed kind, not mercenary, and he immediately asked for her telephone number and asked her out. They discussed a lot of things, and then he walked her home. Andrea invited him in and introduced him to her mother. Mrs. Moore also seemed like a completely different person to him then. She fed him a delicious dinner and offered him fragrant tea with sweets. She smiled kindly and had a good-natured attitude. And at that moment, Brandon decided that Andrea was his destiny. 2 months later, he proposed to her. After the wedding, everything was fine until Andrea was fired from her job. And after that, all the problems started. At first, Andrea was still doing the household chores, but gradually she paid less and less attention to home and more often took care of herself, dumping all the chores on him. Brandon was distracted from his memories by a phone call. The second employer called and asked him to come in on his day off, since he was short-staffed. Brandon thought that the extra work would distract him from his sad thoughts and agreed. He was standing near the truck when he heard some man sharply reprimanding someone on the phone. He cautiously looked out from behind the car. "What on earth am I supposed to do about it now? Tell him he's fired," the man shouted, waving some papers in the air. "What are you looking at? Haven't you got enough work?" he told angrily in Brandon's direction and swearing through the documents on the ground. But Brandon walked over calmly, picked up the papers, and running through the documents immediately noticed the flaws in them. "Were you shouting because of the inaccuracy in the right column?" asked Brandon, and apologizing, hurriedly handed the papers back to the surprised owner. He was about to leave, but the man already stopped him. He realized that Brandon was good in paperwork and asked him to help sort it out instead of the employee who had let him down. After 10 minutes, Brandon returned the documents in good order, and the man could not resist asking why such a smart guy was working as a loader. And Brandon told him about his life. The man introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, and it turned out that he had his own company, specialized in cargo transportation. Mr. Thompson saw how quickly Brandon managed to handle the paperwork and offered to be his assistant. A year passed. Brandon became Mr. Thompson's right-hand man. Now he was making good money, visited many countries together with his boss, bought a car, and made repairs in his apartment. One day he returned from his vacation, and to his unpleasant surprise, he was greeted at home by his wife and mother-in-law. "What are you doing here?" asked Brandon irritably. "Oh, my dear son-in-law is home. All this time I've been telling Andrea to come back to you," laughed the mother-in-law unnaturally. "Forgive her, she's just a woman." But Brandon got his courage up and said firmly, "No, that's it. I'm filing for divorce. As you dreamed, Andrea, I learned how to earn, and now it's your turn." Andrea burst into tears and threw herself at her husband's feet. begging for forgiveness. Mrs. Moore stood there with her mouth open, but then she could not stand it and said, "That's it, Andrea. Stop humiliating yourself. Let's get out of here. He doesn't deserve you. He was shameless and he's still shameless." A few days later, the company where Brandon had been working was celebrating its anniversary. After sitting among his colleagues for a while, Brandon decided to go home by feet. Walking through the night city, he noticed a single figure sitting on a bench. When he got closer, he realized that it was a young woman, and she was crying. Brandon approached her and asked if she needed help. At first, the woman pretended to be fine, but he insisted, and she told him the whole story. Her name was Linda, and the circumstances were so unfortunate that she had nowhere to sleep. She had been kicked out of her rented apartment, she had no cash at all, and her friend she could have stayed at had not yet returned to the city. Brandon felt sorry for the woman and gave her money for a hotel. "Thank you so much. I feel so uncomfortable, but I'll definitely pay it all back." Linda took Brandon's phone number, but he didn't expect her to return the money at all. To his great surprise, she called a week later. The woman explained that she had just gotten her paycheck and she would like to pay Brandon back. "You don't need to do that, Linda. It would be better if you agree to have dinner with me instead of this." Thus began their relationship. Brandon divorced Andrea, who remained living with her mother. A year later, he married Linda, and on the same day, they flew to the sunny Dominican Republic.